Cool. Thank you ever so much, Lucy, and thank you all for joining us. What better way to start your weekend than the virtual boy band that is Stephen, Gareth, and Paul, a bunch of brainier, more handsome blokes you will not find. And it's a great chance for us to start the weekend quizzing them about another amazing week in Insight 2020, which has proved to be, I think, truly awesome. So for those of you who missed any of the sessions that we talk about, you can go and find them on the website and have a look through. But we'll kick off with some questions now. Of course, please add your questions to the chat function, and we will quiz Stephen, Gareth, and Paul as we go through. But I have some questions that I'll put together that I'm really keen to ask. But I completely understand that you may have something that is just as exciting. So please let us know. So one of the key things, as many of you listening will know, is that the reason that we do analytics at the strategy unit and across the NHS is to help with decision making. And so a key part of doing this is to understand what decisions have been made. So if it's okay, Paul, I'll start with you and then move on to Steve. But since you've done that wonderful work that you shared on Tuesday about so a lovely piece of quality work, looking at the workforce and COVID. Where do you think what decisions have been made? What things may have changed since you've started that analysis?
Thanks, Andy, and hello, everyone. I think there have been some changes and other more expected. So the findings that we shared were really hot off the press. We had shared them with the client, with the STP in advance. And they're based on a report which they've read, and we're just making the final amendments now to agree with them a final draft. So that is all feeding into their current planning. So there are sort of decisions in train, a decision-making process in train. However, when we were doing the work, we took a rapid cycle approach. So what we were presenting was based on the full sort of 80-page huge discursive report. But while we were actually doing the work, every sort of fortnight we provided headline findings, and also the model we took was where we had a joint approach where people from the strategy unit did some of the work, but we also trained commissioning staff within the CCG to do interviews, so they were actually able to get insights directly themselves and make decisions, on the basis of what they were hearing.
Yeah.
I think a key, so although it's not a formal decision, but it's something which I know people reflected on during the work, and I think there's a sort of although it's not a minuted decision, it's something which I know everyone has been reflecting on there, which is about the place of care homes in the system and how valued or not they were and during the crisis and have been historically. So issues about which many people will be familiar with because they weren't particular to this SDP, but things about the lack of equity in PPE access. GPs would only go in the care home in full sort of ET style PPE, but the staff in there didn't have any, or social workers didn't have any who were having to go in there to provide care. So that was something which is people have already been reflecting on. Yeah, I mean, there's various other things which, but I'm sure various other things which people have learned and started to think about. But in terms of a concrete decision, that's probably the closest at the moment.
So thank you ever so much, Paul. And when you talk about care homes, I think that leads us nicely to speak to Steve about the amazing research that's recently come out about the last 2 years of life and end of life care. So we know how important your first 1,000 days and your last 1,000 days are, and this is an amazing bit of research that you guys have produced. Brilliant. So how do you think it will influence decisions, or how has it influenced decisions so far, Steve?
So yeah, I'm completely with you. Analysis, its primary function is to support decision making and support good decision making. And ordinarily, when we produce these sorts of outputs, we would we would also produce a series of very clear recommendations, things that we think people ought to be doing, decisions they ought to be making based on the analysis that we produced. And we had a long discussion when we were producing this piece of work about whether that was appropriate in this case. And in the end, we decided not to take that approach, i.e. not to set out a set of recommendations, because we felt there was just such an important next step before those recommendations or decisions could be taken, and that was the discussion. And we didn't want to do anything which might curtail or cut across useful discussions that need to take place in local health economies. These things, the sort of issues that the report raises, are not amenable to technical approaches to answering. They are very value laden, and what we really need is some detailed, in-depth, long-term discussions between the politicians, the public, and clinicians and people like us who might help determine a way forward which is appropriate. So in the end, we went for an approach which kind of says, look, what we think the next step are these discussions, and that's not to assume that in some areas lengthy and detailed discussions aren't already taking place, but we think that really is the next step now. That's the missing piece of the jigsaw puzzle. So that said, I think there is one particular thing that's come out of the report, which I think might lead to some more immediate change. And it was something we were a bit anxious about when we were doing the research. But subsequently, we've had a lot of support for the view, and we feel vindicated from the clinicians that we've spoken to since. And that issue is about the use of chemotherapy in the very last few weeks of life. The evidence base seems to be suggesting that rarely is useful. And we know it happens quite often in reality in the Midlands at the moment. I wouldn't say there was a consensus in the clinical community, but we're not far off that. Most clinicians think it's probably inappropriate to be giving chemotherapy to people in the last few weeks of life. Now, there are some reasons why that might happen unintentionally. We don't always know exactly when somebody's going to die. And of course, chemotherapy does have some fantastic outcomes, even quite late in the day. There may be some survival short as well as that result from that. But that aside, I think most people are of the view that we provide too much of that service to people late in their progression of the disease, and quality of life and maybe even length of life might be extended if we changed our tack in that regard. So that's the one thing I think might be a sort of a particular decision that we might try and take in the Midlands, how we try and manage down the supply of chemotherapy in the very last few weeks ago.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And for those of you who haven't seen it, I would really encourage you to pick up that the research that the guys have done. It's by every individual STP across the patch. It's really, it's an amazing bit of work. So fantastic. So then on to Gareth, and for those of you who may know, Gareth also worked in public health intelligence as well as moonlighting, maybe for the DSU or the DSC, and so but. Gareth chaired a session on Wednesday that looked around, the predictions for the future use of analytics and the role that they will have to play. And so, although we may not have shared a particular bit of analysis, what decisions do you think the system needs to take to better prepare for the use of machine learning, AI, or is it not appropriate to be taking it forward?
Okay, thanks, Andy. Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I think there's a couple of points I just wanted to highlight here, maybe in terms of what we discussed at that session. So I think the first was around, taking the decision to build the sort of necessary data infrastructure that will enable us to do that type of sort of analytics that you mentioned. So, we talked about in the session that we're experiencing an exponential growth in terms of health and care data. So we've got electronic health records, we're seeing more digitisation of things like diagnostics data. So it's exponentially increasing. In the future, we're going to be, have access to more health and care data that will be generated from things like wearable technology, the Internet of Things, various apps. And the big issue is, how do we effectively collate, store, manage, process, and prepare that data ready for analysis. So there's issues like the large-scale data linkage, information governance, data sharing that we're still sort of struggling with within systems at the moment. I suppose one of the only sort of saving graces from the COVID is that it's acted as a bit of an accelerator in terms of data development and tools that we can sort of build on to help generate some of that analysis that you talked about in the future. The other sort of key area where I think we need to take decisions is thinking about how we develop the future skills of the analytical workforce, and how do you think about structuring teams. So Julian Flowers, who's the head of data science at PHE, talked a little bit about this in his session, and he was just introducing this idea of sort of a transdisciplinary analytical team. So having people like data engineers and architects who'd be managing the data and designing data flows and data pipelines, working sort of hand in hand with people undertaking user experience, user research to find out and understand exactly what users want, and working alongside data scientists, people skilled in analytics, visualization experts, statisticians, epidemiologists, just so we've got more of those sort of technical based IT stuff sort of working hand in hand with those with analytical skills. So there's to see much more in terms of overlap and integration, and not seen as separate distinct disciplines. I think those would be the key things that I want to sort of introduce at this stage.
No, and that's fantastic. And for those of you who remember, Ben Goldacre, who opened the Insight 2020, talked about how analysts shouldn't be kind of left alone. They should be, like we're pets at where everyone else goes to work. But I mean, we should be involved in multidisciplinary teams. So not just with analysts all stuck together, but as Gareth, you said, so spreading out across analytics to make sure that we have a broader view, but also the potential to work closely more with clinicians or medics and other people to get the skills and swap. So I think it's a really important part about how we share. And of course, there's AFA, who we do some work with as well, who are looking about professionalizing the role of analysts. But again, a big part of that is how they integrate and work together and create networks. Maybe we should create some kind of decision support center where we could work together and share stuff. But anyway, that's for later. So please, thank you very much for a great opener. And I encourage people to write questions in the chat. And of course, even if it's just to put your hand up, because you can always turn your camera and mic on and we'll let you talk. I promise you don't just have to send a text. But can I just go back to Tuesday's session? And Paul, can I ask you, so for those of you who missed Tuesday's session, Paul, can you give a little précis, just a little snapshot of what you discussed there? But it was a great bit of qualitative work, it involved these interviews. And if after your précis, can you just talk about the changes that you saw and which of those changes struck you the most? What did you feel that was the most significant change?
Yeah, thank you. Well, the work in summary, so we conducted a program of qualitative research across this STP beginning in May. So May to the end of July. And there was around 80 interviews that were conducted, and that was across primary care, community, nursing, cancer services, mental health services, secondary care, and some patient interviews. And just reflecting on what you asked about earlier, Andy, we've written these patient interviews up as stories because they're really powerful insights into, how, particularly these were people who were isolated, and sort of really highlighting the importance of services reaching out and actively making contact with people, and the massive difference that made, and then bringing in services around like social prescribing and things like that around that. So just not the the traditional central health services. So there's a massive amount of information. So I'm pleased you didn't ask me to give a run through of the key findings. But in terms of the you asked, I think, about the the sort of key changes to care. I mean, at risk of perhaps stating the obvious, was the move to online, remote support, which, you know, we're months down the line, aren't we now? And it has become, I mean, look at us all here today. You know, it has, working remotely has just very quickly become the day to day. But it's easy to forget how new that was, I think, at the early stages of the pandemic. And in the STP, they went from having, I don't know, I can't remember what it was, but, you know, a handful of practices who used online beyond, you know, accepting emails, to total triage across the whole of the patch in about literally about sort of 6 weeks.
Yeah.
And including practice, you know, you think about primary care, you've got everything from your sort of super practices to your sort of, you know, a couple of people, really small. And there's also, this area's got quite a big rural geography as well. And it was, I suppose, through necessity, embraced. And people who would perhaps had been perceived or had been vocally against, or been very vocal about their concerns about using remote consultation in primary care, saw how effective it could be, and actually how it enabled them to deliver care to their patients in different ways. There was, I mean, I think there's been a whole load of learning through it. I think initially some of the pre-pandemic ideas about, you know, using video consultation and stuff was about saving time, but it doesn't necessarily save time. But it's about how you use the triage and how, you know, who are the patients that you need to have the video consultations with as opposed to over the phone, what are the sorts of conditions, but also freeing up then for the continued face-to-face, and how there'll always be, you know, a role for face-to-face and sort of post. Well, I suppose we're officially second wave now, aren't we? How you know, there's a new blended approach, but it's not just primary care. In secondary care, moving to video consultation as well, and real sort of benefits for patients, for outpatients, of not having to traipse into the hospital, of being able to do that at a time that's convenient to them, and those clinicians as well seeing the benefits for them. Also, you know, clinicians being able to work from home, having virtual MDT meetings, a whole range of different things which have been sort of, you know, these are things which were knocking around and were ambitions and aimed for, but were really accelerated. And then as well, then links remotely into care homes, and we saw that towards the end. I mean, it was sort of later, but then linking up, kitting up care homes that didn't have iPads and stuff, or for those that did, making use of them so that care could be given remotely in those settings as well. So that for me was a sort of I mean, there's loads of examples, isn't there? But that was a real standout because it existed across the system, and it enabled, for example, better links between primary and secondary care as well. And they started to work in new ways, designing new patient pathways together virtually around to reduce admissions or to support discharge.
Thank you very much. And before I ask Stephen or Gareth if they want to comment, one more question from me. When you had a look or a chance to review the workforce changes, were you able to kind of link those changes to the impact on care and patient management? Was there some involvement there where we could look at you know, potential outcomes or outputs as a proxy, or what the patients thought?
Not really, to be honest with you, because this piece of work was a purely qualitative piece of work, but it's a companion piece to the modelling and analytical work that the STP are doing,
yeah,
with support from the strategy unit and the DSC, I would add. So, and then it's for them, and as part of you, to go back to your first earlier question about decision making, they now need to look at those things together. Yeah.
Cool. Stephen, is there anything that you'd like to add or to comment on?
Well, just that there seems to be this recurrent theme about whether we should be trying to get back to where we were before, or whether this should be a real opportunity to do something different. I mean, I've heard that debate quite a lot in some of the conversations I've had around ED activity levels, attendances at accident emergency departments, which fell really rapidly just after the lockdown, and are still some way off what they were at this point last year. And we're sort of caught in this debate about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. Are we missing some cases that we really should be treating and there's going to be adverse consequences for? Or are we managing them in a more imaginative way because we've had to now? We've had to find other ways of working. I don't know whether, Paul, that sort of debate, I imagine that came up time and time again in the work you were doing.
Yeah. No. And thank you, Stephen. And Gareth, is there anything you'd like to add?
I'm not sure there's anything much to add from me. I mean, I guess from a sort of public health perspective, you know, our sort of, obviously we're very much focused on the sort of pandemic response at the moment, but then, you know, we're obviously starting to think about, some of the longer term sort of implications of COVID. So yeah, I'm not sure I could add much more than that at this stage.
Cool. Well, I think without doubt, the single most important question of today, qualitative or quantitative, Paul, and don't say mixed methods.
Well, what sort of question is that?
We may never talk to you ever again.
Well, it depends what the question is that you want to answer. Sorry, I've got to say that. If you want to know sort of what's happening, then you need to look at numbers, don't you? You want to know numbers going through, people being seen, what's happening, so on and so forth. If you want to know what people think about it and sort of what it means, then you need to talk to them about it. So I'm sorry if that I can't come down on one. Of course, you know, as evaluation lead at the DSC, we would always promote mixed methods.
Absolutely. Stephen, I look to the analyst. Are you going to say quantitative?
I'm not actually. No, I'm not going to say that. I think we're on a bit of we're on a high at the moment. Quantitative analytics in the NHS and health and social care is getting a real boost at the moment. That's great, and I think we could do a lot more of it and do it a lot better. But I think if I were choosing where to put the next pound, it would probably be on most pieces of work a bit of qualitative research, because quants can take you so far. They can give you a nice definitive answer to a definitive question, but they can't tell you whether you're asking the right question, and they can't tell you why. And unless you have that bit alongside quantitative analysis, it will only take you so far. So yeah, we're lucky in the strategy that we have both disciplines. But I think generally speaking, across the NHS, we tend to under-resource the quantitative research. So.
Yeah, so as Lucy, who gets a huge thumbs up from me, just pointed out that text mining and things like natural language processing could also potentially be used to go for the quant side. But Gareth, I'm guessing as an epidemiologist at heart, but in your public health role, quali or quant?
I'm definitely a poor man's epidemiologist, I think. I don't know. I mean, they're complementary, aren't they? Yeah, it's difficult. I think it comes down to sort of problem structuring and the question you're trying to address ultimately. I think I'd agree with Stephen in terms of, certainly from a public health perspective, good sort of qualitative research is probably, not in abundance. So yeah, I'd say they're complementary and they're both needed and required more than ever at the moment. I think we're sort of a bit awash with data and sort of, struggling to make sense of all the sort of data, particularly around COVID, that's just sort of swamping everyone. Actually, you might generate some more useful insights from some good sort of qualitative research.
Super. Anyway, I'm going to lie on Twitter and say that you all said quantitative, so don't worry. Anyway, so Gareth, if I could stay with you, if that's okay, and talk about the Wednesday morning session, because it'd be really good to, again, if possible, if you could just give us a really quick précis for those who may not have been able to join of what was discussed, and then because I'm really, really interested to understand, what you think about your role of AI and machine learning will have. But can you give us a little overview?
Sorry, I'm off mute now. This session on Wednesday morning was very much focused around the sort of future of analytics. So it was very much quite an informal, fun in inverted commas, sort of crystal ball gazing session, I guess, where we had sort of three three experts who we'd invited just to give their sort of different perspectives on where they saw the future of analytics sort of heading. So we had Mohammed from the strategy unit, who was talking about the evaluation of artificial intelligence interventions and the sort of importance of doing that, and not sort of solely just focusing on the sort of technology and the sort of the data outputs. So he gave a nice sort of introduction around all that. Then we had Stephen actually as well, just offering a sort of broader perspective on sort of three potential approaches and thoughts around how he saw the future of more strategic analytics sort of changing over time. And then finally we had Julian Flowers, who's Public Health England's head of data science, again sort of talking in a bit more detail about how he saw particularly sort of large scale data and data science sort of methods changing and evolving over the next sort of 2 or 3 years or so. So it was quite a sort of thought-provoking, engaging sort of session, I guess, just to stimulate a bit of discussion and debate. Just in relation to your particular question around the sort of role of machine learning and AI, I mean, obviously it's got sort of huge potential. It's being comprehensively used within the commercial sector. I think probably, certainly from a sort of public health intelligence perspective, we're sort of tentatively exploring it at the moment. So I mean, I've got a colleague in my team who's employed supervised machine learning methods as part of some cluster analysis that we've done around some population segmentation work. So quite a sort of practical example of how you can employ it. But I think in terms of its role in the future, I think it'll ultimately mean that most of the day-to-day sort of current routine analysis it is automated, and it'll be underpinned by artificial intelligence. And what I mean by that, I think AI will assist in terms of improving data quality. So it'll help to fill in missing data. It'll help with suggesting missing codes. It'll help in terms of data cleansing and improving data quality. And I think it'll ultimately assist in terms of turning some of those large-scale data collections into analysable data sets. And it should sort of enable a whole host of analysis which we don't or currently can't do, or maybe haven't even conceived of, to be undertaken. I think there's sort of two key issues around that for me. One's in terms of the sort of interpretation, the translation of some of the outputs generated from machine learning and AI. So can we really make sense of what the data is actually saying, and how can it be used to inform a sort of a decision that needs to be made? So very much an emphasis on that interpretation, translation. And I think the second element is around a sort of accompanying ethical framework. So getting us to think about, when should we be employing these methods, and how, and we need sort of transparency in terms of our methods and our approaches. And that's going to be really key to developing and maintaining the sort of public's trust and their engagement in terms of what we do with their data ultimately. So in the West Midlands, some work I'm involved with West Midlands Police around violence prevention. So they're starting to use machine learning methods to develop algorithms to look at where violent crimes are occurring and where violent incidents are taking place. And there's very much a strong emphasis on that accompanying ethical framework to just ensure we use that appropriately, and how it's then used to inform decisions to take practical action.
No, thank you, Gareth. And Stephen, obviously this is something that is close to your heart, as in maybe not using machine learning and AI per se in every day, but when is appropriate to use machine learning and AI. So, what were your thoughts about the Wednesday session?
Yeah, I mean, I do get a little bit frustrated when I hear media sort of commentary type stuff on machine learning. There's a couple of things that annoy me. One is that they kind of imply this is a brand new discipline that's come out of nowhere. And in reality, it's evolved over a period of time from a lot of things that we're much more knowledgeable on and comfortable with. It has evolved fairly rapidly for an academic discipline, but nonetheless, it's not a brand new brand new sites by any means. And the other thing that irritates me is the comparison with applications in more commercial settings. If you think about how Amazon use AI and machine learning, they're recommending, you know, what I don't know, what food processor I should buy, for example. You know, Netflix might be recommending the next movie I watch or something like that. I'm sure they're very important for the commercial considerations of those companies, but they mean very little to the individual concerned. Whereas the sorts of decisions we're talking about, AI and machine learning influencing in healthcare settings, are much, much more fundamental. They're about, you know, whether we live or die, and you know, how healthy we are, and who should get treatment. And rightly, we're taking our time to consider how we to do that appropriately. And we're not rushing in and deploying lots of these tools without being really clear what the consequences might be. And I think Mohammed's session on Wednesday was really sobering, really. He kind of set out all the questions that we really need to address if we're going to be confident that we're selecting the right AI and machine learning tools, and they're going to get adopted and used appropriately. And it's a much more difficult task than I think most of our commercial counterparts are considering.
Well, thanks, Steve. And Paul, if I can come to you, you know, you've successfully just led a bid to be on the framework for NHSX to evaluate the AI programs that they're putting in place. The NHSX are funding £150 million, I understand, over the next 3 years in AI, and you know, you'll be responsible for evaluating a few of those technologies. So, what are your thoughts about AI and machine learning and their future role in analytics, and as you say, that the important decisions they may be making on our health?
Well, my main thoughts are that I've got a lot to learn, to be honest with you, Andy. And with Mohammed as our leader, I did bring leaders on getting on the framework, but it's not my area of technical expertise. But certainly, you know, I haven't got much to add to what's already been said. You know, there are huge potentials, and you know, rightly huge concerns about it. And I think there are. You know, I'm reassured to see that the checks and balances that are being put in before these technologies do get rolled out at scale, because you know there are huge commercial pressures and huge amounts of commercial investment that have gone into these technologies, and you know there's some very obvious benefits we've already heard about, but you know. It really is cutting edge stuff, actually, and it's both pushing at the boundaries of people's understanding, but also at people's understanding of how it can be regulated, and how how safety can be assured.
I remember when I very first started at NHSC in the UK models team, advising on health analytics. One of the questionnaires we sent out was, do you do a kind of individual person impact assessment? Do you do a finance assessment? And one of them does, do you do an ethical impact assessment of the work that you would do? And lots of the vanguards replied saying, of course we do. And me and my boss at the time, Garrett Lewis, went, amazing. Can we see one? Because we've never seen one. And then of course they went very quiet because they may have just ticked the box without actually I'm thinking it through, but as I say, that the idea of having a potential ethical framework where we can, for those who sit on panels or working as ethicists as well, can help guide people through the decisions, because very rarely do we have the time to be dedicated to doing ethics or philosophy to be able to pull this together. So again, I think it's a great idea to think of a potential framework that we can push something through. But one of the points that you made was around looking how AI can start to replicate or clean data for us, and to be able to make data and fill in some of the blanks. And so, Steve, if I can go to you in your Thursday session, because I think the wonderful work that was released around end-of-life care, because one of the things that stood out for me, besides the amazing research and all this, again, I encourage everyone to look at it, but was the data and the issues with the amount of data that was coming through. And so could AI have a role to play there? And then about filling in the blanks and appropriately filling in the blanks or imputing the data. And then, and for those who may have missed Thursday, can you give us a quick overview of what you discussed?
Sure, yeah. So there were 3 speakers at the session on Thursday. Justine Wiltshire, who works in the strategy unit, Kate Warren, who works for both the local authority in Wolverhampton, but also for the Health Trust. And also we had a presentation from Anna Locke, who's a palliative care consultant. So Justine's presentation was focused on a piece of work we've released recently, which, I mean, the core of it focuses on patterns of healthcare use that people experience as they approach the end of life. It looks at the 2 years prior to people's deaths. And this is not a new concept. And people have done good work in this area before. In particular, the Nuffield Trust did a really good report on this topic a few years ago. If there's something novel in what we've done this time round, it's that we've tried to produce that sort of analysis at a very local level, so that individual STPs and ICSs can see how those numbers play out for them in particular, and the particular nuances and variation that they might experience that might be relevant to others. So Justine's produced 11 reports, one for each of the STPs across the West Midlands, and she's built, she and a colleague have built the underlying data frameworks and code so that we could, in theory, produce a similar report for any STP across the country relatively quickly now. The report, I guess the challenge that the report opens with is pointing out what's happening to the trend in deaths in this country. So that since about the mid-1970s, the numbers of deaths per year that's been happening in England have been falling. And they've been falling pretty steadily year on year. And then they reversed in around 2010-11. And they started to rise again. So of course, over that period from the mid-1970s, the population has been growing, but the number of deaths per year has been falling because life expectancy has been improving and mortality rates have been improving. So that trend, that downward trend, reversed in 2010 or thereabouts, and it's projected to carry on increasing at least for the next 10 or 15 years, maybe even longer than that. And the reason why that's a challenge for the health service is because an awful lot of healthcare provision is focused on supporting people in that last 2-year period. And so that represents a huge resource challenge for the NHS. Unless we change the patterns of care considerably, then we're going to be faced with huge pressures on acute hospital beds, on nursing home and care home beds, for example, on palliative care provision otherwise. And you know, I think about 20 years ago there was a big concern about the demographic time bomb. As a time bomb never really went off because it was misconstrued really. But this really is a time bomb. This is happening, and this is happening now. The next 10 years, we're going to see a massive increase in the numbers of people dying and the pressures they apply to the health service, unless we find better ways of organising care. And the other thing the report does was try to highlight that it doesn't look like we've got the patterns right at the moment by any means, either in terms of personal preferences, but also if you look at the proportion of the care that's delivered to people in those last 2 years, predominantly it's unplanned care. And unplanned care is rarely a positive experience. Nobody likes going to A&E or being admitted to hospital in an emergency or journeying in an ambulance. And it's usually a signal of some earlier failure in the system. And if we really should be moving to a much more planned and organised arrangements for people as they approach death. And that relies on lots of things, including improvements in prognostication. But those are in train. I think they will come and they will help. So those are the sorts of issues that that the report considers. It also looks at whether there's any evidence of non-beneficial treatments, patients receiving non-beneficial treatments in the last few years of life. I've already mentioned chemotherapy. There's also some analysis of people's use of critical care in the last few years of life as well, which is also often inappropriate and futile. So that was the piece of work that Justine talked about. Kate Warren gave a really important piece of presentation talking about a very similar piece of analysis she's done, or her team have done in Wolverhampton, but in managing to incorporate many more points of delivery than we were able to do from the national data sets. So she managed to incorporate primary care data and community service data, for example, in the analysis, the social care data too, in the analysis she's done, and talked about the year-long, is my word, but battle with NHS Digital to get permissions to do that piece of work, and the need to be really persistent to get those authorities through. And then we heard at the end from Anna Locke a very sort of personal perspective on working as a palliative care consultant and how better data might really influence how they go about their business and the planning of those services in the future.
Yeah, I'd love to talk a bit about the over medicalized death in a second, but so this idea of as you say, that there was like 30% of the data was to hand, and so that obviously means there's a big chunk missing, give or take. And so is it appropriate for things like AI machine learning to be able to fill those gaps, or should we be going to, or what can we do to encourage people? Is it system leaders? Is it the people putting the data in? Is it better linkage? What can we do as a system? What can we, us listening today, what can we do to try and improve that data to make sure that the data quality is there, or the data is just there?
Yeah, so there's two separate issues, I think. There is an issue about the availability and permissions to link certain data sets, primary care, social care. And then there's a separate debate about the quality of some of those underlying data sets and what AI can do for that. If we look at the data linkage question first, I think you can break it down to three sub-questions. Do we have the technology to do it and the skills to do it? Should we do it? Is it appropriate for us to be linking these data sets for these purposes? And third, do we have the permissions to do it? So the first one I think is easy to answer. We've been doing deterministic and probabilistic data linkage for a long time. We know how to do it. That's not the barrier anymore. That's really not the issue holding us back. Should we do it? I think I very rarely come across requested use cases for this sort of data linkage that I think are inappropriate. But we really put them through a very, very long approval process through NHS Digital. At the moment, I think SDPs are being told they really should have linked data sets available, routinely linked data sets available across their system. That's an expectation the centre's been put on each SDP, but it hasn't unblocked the legislative issues. It could do that, I think, relatively quickly. And I'm not talking about some emergency COVID legislation here. I'm talking about a permanent agreement about what data can be linked for what purpose. And to do that nationally once for everybody. The idea that every time somebody like Kate wants to link some data for a perfectly plausible and sensible approach, which will almost inevitably lead to improvements in care for people, should have to wait a year before that gets approved. I just think that's well, I won't use the word, but yeah, I don't think that's appropriate anymore. And I think if the government and NHS England really want to in this area, they could do quite quickly, I think, by agreeing some changes to legislative arrangements.
Yeah, and I find it odd that we know that there are significant chunks of the country now with fully integrated data, primary care, secondary care, community, adult social services. The wonderful Health Foundation's Network Data Lab has pulled together, I think, five sites, 3 from England, 1 from Wales and Scotland, again, who have access to primary and secondary care and social care data to be able to work together. There's a wonderful opportunity to see how it's done and can make a real difference. And we know on our patch, we've had the Leeds integrated records for ages, but Nottingham on our patch have had a wonderful data set. And I've been very spoilt in London with an integrated data set now for, 4 or 5 years, if not longer. So it seems frustrating that we can see that what could be the very powerful good that can be done by this. And we know it's doable in the system because it's been done elsewhere in the system, places that face the same risks and the same challenges that we do. So what can we do to encourage locally for this to happen? Who do we need to speak to? What can we do to help, Stephen?
Yeah, I'm going to avoid your question and answer another one if that's all right. But just because I don't think the real deficit is with local areas at the moment. I really do think it's a national steer that's missing. And not just a steer, but the legislative framework underpins it. And one of my frustrations with this area is that, yes, you're right, lots of areas have done it and have been linking data for some time and have had permissions. that should be a precedent. That means that it should be easier for other people now to come along and do something similar. But each time we try to make these decisions, it seems like we have to go back to square one and start all over again. And I think, I think we've got that fundamentally wrong at the moment. So I'm looking up, not down, on this issue at the moment. I think that's where the solution is now. Not always the case, but in this case, I think that's true.
Gareth.
Yeah, Andy, I was just going to come in there. I mean, I think the frustrating thing for me over the last few years is the amount of time that it's taken, you know, analysts involved in data sharing. You know, they get embroiled with all the sort of paperwork and the, you know, the discussions and difficulties with NHS Digital, and it's just not a good use of analytical time. You know, we need to sort of, streamline the process and enable those things to happen more easily. So totally, agree with what Stephen's saying around it. You know, a national approach is really needed. You know, and then we could utilise the analytical resource locally, to better effect.
Excellent. Paul, you must have this frustration a lot when you're trying to do evaluations and trying to pull this stuff together. So shall I be going to Ming Tang and the guys at NHSD rather than complaining to my other boss, Peter? Which one?
Well, yeah, I would do whatever Stephen says, to be honest with you, because I rely on the expertise of him and other colleagues who know the insides out of this. I mean, I was just, you know, one of the things about integrating data is that it supports integrated working, and you know, I wasn't able to come to the session, and I haven't had a proper look at the report. I'll be honest with you, I've just had a quick look through it, but you know, we know what people want at the end of life broadly, and you know, this report from Stephen and Justine really, you know, shines a light on the issues, doesn't it, of what's going on. I saw a tweet from the Chief Exec of Hospice UK who says the report's a game changer. Yeah, and I think one of the things about integrating data is different bits of the system can then see. It helps them understand how things are a shared problem. So, you know, you're talking about data being siloed, but, you know, we all know working is often siloed, and when you can understand things from a system perspective, then it should support system working and system outcomes.
And again, for anyone online who wants to know how we did it in London, if you want to see the data sharing agreements, what the data controllers signed, the processes to get it, all of that is open. Yeah, we're happy to share how we managed it. Again, there's a huge amount of, like Gareth has mentioned, a huge amount of shoe leather. We had a wonderful lady called Amanda Lucas who led a team who spent years convincing the data controllers. That's individual GP practices on our patch, so 376, as well as community care, the trusts, the mental health, to be able to do this. So it takes a certain kind of tenacious, persistent individuals. And for those of you who know Abraham George from Kent, you know, one of the most charming, lovely men you'll ever meet. And again, he still had a battle for years to get the data flowing, but got there in the end. But if any of that would help you in your patch, wherever it may be, we're very happy to connect you to those amazing people who have actually made it happen at scale across those systems, as well as obviously colleagues in Nottingham. So we're drawing to near the end, and I'm really keen for those of you who've been listening to me, you know, as a fanboy talking to three awesome guys chat away. But if there are any questions, you know, feel free to put your hand up, or if you want me to read your question out for you and check my poor English, feel free to throw it into the chat box or signal to ask the guys a question. Otherwise, I still have more, but I understand that, you know, I've been rattling on. So is there anything that you guys would like to ask the you know, Stephen, Gareth and Paul that we have here today? That overwhelming and crushing silence means that I get to ask you about the Wednesday afternoon session. And I suppose, and for those of you who weren't there for the Wednesday afternoon session, we were talking about how you know, the analytical collaboration for COVID-19 and the different approaches taken. And one of the things that one of the key bits was the national modelling versus local modelling, and how those two things play and are either complementary or potentially challenging. So, Stephen, if I come to you first, and because it's really good to get your thoughts about the differences and what we were kind of asked to do or look to do, and again, what we can do better for second wave or today, right now, as things kick off.
Yeah, I think, and I'm sure others know this better than I do. I was a little bit removed from it, but one of the frustrations I heard people express regularly in the early stages of the pandemic, the first few months, was that they didn't know whether they were obliged to rely on their own analysis or whether they should wait for the national results to come out. And I think we lost a lot of time and being uncertain what was going to happen nationally and whether there was going to be a national model that everyone should be obliged to follow, or whether or not really they should get on with building their own. And a lot of confusion arose out of that, and inefficiency arose out of that gap, really. So that's my main reflection, really, that next time round, the centre have to be much more clear about their expectations. Do they want people to hold off and use their models? Or do they want people to go ahead and build their own and rely on their own models? I think, given experiences, people will tend now to assume that they're not going to get anything from the centre and to build their own, because the ones who I think really struggled maybe this time around were the ones who waited and waited and waited, being promised models that never quite arrived, or arrived but didn't quite do all the things they were hoping they might do. So yeah, that's my reflection. The other thing, maybe Gareth, you might have some insight into this, is about how the different national agencies coordinate on that as well, and whether this time round we might see a sort of combined NHS England PHE model. I mean, I know the politics on that is changing every day at the moment, and there's lots of complexities, but I'd be interested in Gareth's view on whether he knows what might happen next time round.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Stephen in terms of, yeah, it's sort of riddled with difficulty, and certainly, yeah, within PHE, we sort of we had a few frustrations in terms of we sort of had a model ready to go that we weren't able to sort of share for political reasons. So I don't think there is a sort of, yeah, joint modelling approach sort of being discussed at the moment, as far as I know, in terms of a second wave. I mean, certainly, yeah, but we found that quite a lot of local teams sort of took on board and adopted their own sort of modelling approaches and did this quite well. And there was a lot of sort of, you know, sharing of ideas and approaches, certainly between different local authority public health teams. So I think there was a model that was produced by some colleagues in Sheffield, and that was sort of, you know, almost shared around the country, and people were adapting it to their sort of local circumstance. I mean, in terms of modelling, I mean, I always go back to a famous quote by a famous statistician, George Box, who talked about, you know, all models are wrong, some are useful. And I think, you know, that's just a useful way to sort of approach modelling. It's just there to, you know, hopefully better inform a decision, but it's not going to necessarily give you a sort of definitive answer. And that was sort of, yeah, I guess my sort of take in the first wave, and one I'd sort of still stand by.
And Paul, your thoughts around, you know, the kind of the complexities of, you know, the national and local.
Well, I haven't got too much to add really, but I was just reflecting that, you know, the policy ambition is for, you know, integrated systems, isn't it, locally, but there isn't integrated systems nationally, and that doesn't always support, yeah, what's trying to happen at a more local level, because it's not joined up at the top.
Obviously, I'm completely outraged you didn't use the model created by Imperial. What were we doing? But anyway, besides that, so guys, we have 3 minutes left. So any chances for any last questions before we say goodbye? And again, I will answer the OWL question in the chat. But but I just want to say a colossal thank you. So any last questions before we wrap up? Any hands up? Cheers to Gal, nice to see you again, an active member of AFA, you know, as we all should be. Any other questions before we go? No, so I just want to say a massive thank you, Stephen, Gareth and Paul, not only for your contributions this week and today, but for the amazing reports and stuff that you've been doing. So a huge thank you from me and from the guys at Insight 2020 and the Festival of Analytics. For those who are attending, any questions at all for us, please let me know either from email, contact the Insights team, or contact us directly, and we'll do our best to give you any more information. And as always, the work that these guys do is publicly and freely available, the code to NHS colleagues around the system. So if you want to know how we did something, we're happy to share it. So it's all of ours to share. So please let us know, and we're happy to talk you through it. So on that note, I just want to say a massive thank you to everyone. Have a wonderful weekend. And I will hopefully see you guys all.
Thanks, Andy. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Cheerio, guys.